All right, let's do this. I have refrained from offering any commentary, at least in video form, on what's been happening between Iran and Israel over the last couple of weeks. Not because it isn't important, it is important, and now I am commenting on it. But and I did make some comments along the way on social media for sure, but I hadn't made a video about it until now. So why? Well, it was because I wasn't exactly sure what to say when because things were happening so rapidly and they were changing. And I'm one of those individuals who, as I caution others to do, who watches what is happening and doesn't necessarily feel the need to immediately form some sort of opinion. I want to wait for more evidence that corroborates this thought or refutes it or whatever. I don't necessarily feel the need to immediately jump in. So there were certainly comments that I made along the way on social media or whatever. But yeah, I didn't make a video about it. But now, supposedly, we're under a ceasefire. The ceasefire has been in effect for, I guess, a couple of days now. So I figured I would go ahead and make a video and share some thoughts on what is being called the 12-day war. And um, I don't mean to diminish the impact of what has happened. I mean, clearly there are people who've been affected by this. Um, but and this is significant. And I don't think we are done seeing what we're going to see as part of the conflict between Israel and Iran or just other conflicts that could pop up in the region that could involve us, other Western powers, or other powers that may be on the side of Iran. So let's talk about it. Let's go through this. So I don't necessarily want to rehash in detail everything that happened during the 12-day war, but I do want to share some thoughts on where we are now. And in order to do that, I do kind of want to hit the high notes of what happened during the 12-day war. Now, I'm using that term because this is the term that has been used, that has been affixed to this nearly 2-week period. So I think Trump used it. So anyway, I'm just going to use that. So what I'm not going to do is talk about everything that has happened in the region leading up to it. That is far outside the scope of this video here. Obviously, there have been ongoing tensions between Israel and its neighbors for a very, very long time. So we're not going to talk about all of that. What I do want to talk about, though, is what happened in March. So in March, Tulsi Gabbard, who of course serves on President Trump's administration as the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, because remember, we've got all these intelligence agencies, and these intelligence agencies produce their own individual reports, etc. You know, together they make up what is often called the U.S. intelligence community. But then you have a single director kind of on top of that entire intelligence apparatus that is made up of all of these intelligence agencies, and it can be problematic. But anyway, so Tulsi Gabbard in March made this assessment in which she stated, and everyone's heard this now, right? She stated that it was the assessment of the intelligence community that Iran was not building a bomb and that the nuclear program had not been kind of recommenced since it had been decommissioned, you know? So it was decommissioned, I think, in 2003, and it was the assessment of the intelligence community that it had not been recommissioned. Now, she did go on to say that Iran appeared to have a lot of enriched uranium for a state that supposedly doesn't have nuclear weapons. Okay, so let's kind of parse through that for just a moment. And you can go and you can look at the exact quote that she made, because I know there are differing opinions on this. But to me, it looked like she changed her assessment. And she wanted to make it look like the media was taking her original assessment out of context. I don't personally buy that. Maybe you feel differently, and if so, that's cool. To me, she clearly said, and go find the exact quote, she put it on her social media. She clearly said the IC assesses that Iran is not building an atomic weapon, okay, or a nuclear bomb, right? And then she says the IC also assesses that Iran's nuclear program is not currently in operation and hasn't been since it was decommissioned by the Ayatollah. She offers no qualifiers to that statement, at least the way that I see it. Now, she does offer some additional context, but she doesn't offer a qualifier to that assessment that they're not building a nuclear weapon and their nuclear program is not currently in operation. Okay? That's kind of the one line assessment. And then she goes on to say, hey, however, it does look like they have an awful lot of enriched uranium for a country that is not working on nuclear weapons. Now, let's just take a minute and just talk about exactly what that means. So if you want to go learn about the uranium enrichment process, go look that up. You can figure that out in great detail. But let me give you just the very quick down and dirty, at least as I understand it. Certainly not an expert on this. So when you find uranium in nature, and you extract it, it's going to come out kind of mixed in with other elements. It's going to be known as uranium ore, but it's not just going to be pure natural uranium. It's going to contain all these other elements with it. You're going to process it. You're going to strip out those other unwanted elements, and you're going to be left with a uranium compound. Now, that uranium compound, okay, when you think about natural uranium, so natural uranium is less than 1% of U-235, which is why you later have to enrich it. It is more than 99% U-238. Okay. And then there are probably trace amounts of other isotopes there, like U-234 or whatever. But it is 99+% U-238. It is less than 1%, more like 0.7% of U-235, which is actually what you need. Okay. So you have the uranium ore. You process it to kind of extract out the other unwanted elements. You're left with uranium compound. Okay, that's known as yellow cake. Okay, the yellow cake is then further processed. It's converted into a gas, uranium hexafluoride, I believe. That gas can be fed into a series of cascading centrifuges. So it's basically fed into centrifuge after centrifuge after centrifuge. Why? When you put it in the centrifuge and then it's spun at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute, then you're going to separate the U-235 from the U-238. So as you spin it super fast in the centrifuge, the lighter U-235 is going to kind of coagulate around the center of the centrifuge. The heavier U-238, which is the majority of the compound, right? The majority of the natural uranium, is going to kind of travel to the outer edge of the centrifuge. Okay. So then what do? As it kind of starts to separate, you continue to feed it into your next centrifuge in this cascading series. And so it becomes further and further and further enriched. What that means is you're getting a higher and higher and higher concentration of U-235. And you're decreasing the amount of uranium-238 that is found in this gas, right, that you've inserted into the centrifuges. So that's what enrichment means. Enrichment means that you are increasing the percentage of U-235 while you are decreasing the percentage of U-238. And you're starting with 99+% of uranium-238, more like 99.3-ish, but whatever. Now, as you enrich it and you get a much higher concentration of U-235, what happens with the remainder? The remainder that has less and less U-235 in it and more U-238 is what we would call depleted uranium. So that can be further processed and used for other purposes like, different types of munitions. You've heard about the use of depleted uranium. So depleted uranium, instead of being more like 99.3% U-238, will be higher. It'll be closer to like 99.8% U-238, et cetera. All right. That's depleted uranium. That's not what you need for nuclear energy or nuclear weapons. So as you're enriching it with your centrifuges and you get a greater concentration of U-235, once you enrich it, and remember, you're starting at about 0.7% U-235. Once you enrich it to about 3%, 5%, in some cases a little bit higher, Now you have the concentration necessary for nuclear energy. In order to in order for it to be considered weapons grade, it's got to be enriched to a much, much higher concentration. And, some sources would tell you as high as 90%. So when Tulsi Gabbard says, hey, they sure do have a lot of enriched uranium, it's because you need far more uranium, and it must be enriched to a much higher concentration to be used for a nuclear weapon than for nuclear energy. A difference of about 3 to 5%, maybe a little bit higher, compared to as high as 90% for a nuclear weapon. Okay, great. Glad we worked through that. If you want to study that in more detail, you can find sources that will explain all that. All right, so she makes this assessment in March. Now, Trump comes out recently and says, and basically dismisses her assessment and says, I think Iran is, working on building a bomb. And then this is what I thought was weird. About a day or two before Israel would first launch their strike on Iran, Tulsi Gabbard comes back out and says, hey, the lying media took my initial assessment out of context. Trump says Iran can't have a nuclear weapon, and I agree. The media is trying to cause a wedge in between Trump and his own administration. I agree with Trump. Now, I thought she had backtracked. And I thought she was trying to blame it on the media and say they were taking her initial assessment out of context. But I don't necessarily see it that way. And I'm not here to say that it's not like I believe everything the media says. Of course not. But anyway, okay. That was about I can't remember exactly when she kind of came out and tried to clarify her initial statement, but it was only about a day or two, if I remember correctly, before the initial preemptive strike by Israel on Iran, which occurred on June 13th, Friday the 13th, as it were. And this operation would be known as Operation Rising Lion. Several people have given some interpretations as to, why it was called Operation Rising Lion or what that might mean. In any case, it's been called Operation Rising Lion. And from what we understand and what we've heard, and I'm not using any crazy sources here, this is just what's been reported, right? Anybody who searches for this, it'll come right up. But it appears that this strike that was done preemptively has as its objective disrupting Iran's nuclear program. And Israel seems to want to do that via two different lines of effort. So if the objective is disrupt Iran's nuclear program, they're doing that through two lines of effort. Now, what exactly are they trying to do? One is damage, perhaps irreparably, according to what Israel wants to do, damage nuclear facilities and their engineering capabilities that would be required to produce nuclear weapons. That would be one line of effort. And then the other would be kill key personnel that are part of this program, the nuclear scientists, et cetera, or key military officials that are part of this program. So anyway, when we're talking about the facilities, that's where we're talking about, these cascading series of centrifuges that you would need to enrich the uranium to such a high concentration of U-235, et cetera. The other, equipment that would be required to carry out the actual engineering of the weapons. And then, of course, you got these key personnel, whether they're scientists, whether they're high-ranking military officers that are part of this program. But from what I see, that's the way they see their two lines of effort that both lead towards this end of significantly disrupting Iran's nuclear program. Okay, so on Friday, June 13th, 2025, they launched this their initial series of preemptive strikes. Okay. Everyone obviously around the world gets, kind of nervous. Iran then does retaliate. And then we see, for what will end up being 12 days, a series of strikes launched back and forth by Iran and Israel. Both countries did suffer damages and casualties from what we understand. There were reports of infrastructure damage. There were reports of casualties. And at least on the part of Iran, there were reports that certain scientists or military officers had supposedly been killed. Is that true? I don't know. There's a lot about this that we don't necessarily know is for sure true. I'm just going off the same reports that everyone else has seen too. Now, On Sunday, June 22nd, the United States carries out what would be called Operation Midnight Hammer. And that consisted of a series of direct strikes by U.S. personnel on 3 nuclear sites: Isfahan, Natanz, and Fordow. Now, you've heard a lot about Fordow. That's the one that people have been speaking out, perhaps more than the others. But that was a big deal because now the United States is not just supporting Israel with intelligence or even with equipment or whatever, or munitions. It's far beyond that. You have U.S. personnel that have entered into Iranian airspace, according to what we've been told, and conducted these direct strikes. So now the United States has fully entered the war, if we're going to call it a war. Now, I would tell you that I would say these strikes were unconstitutional. So again, I'm not talking about whether or not they were a good idea. That's a totally separate question. Okay, you want to talk about strategically or whatever, that is a totally separate question. We can have that discussion. But if we're talking about legally, I would say that they were unconstitutional. And I even asked people on social media, show me in the Constitution where the president has the authorization to conduct the strikes that were done as part of Operation Midnight Hammer. Now, I already knew that people were going to come back and they were going to immediately point to the War Powers Resolution. Now, the War Powers Resolution, and this is not exactly what I want to talk about tonight, so I'm not going to dwell on this. We could do a whole video just on that, and there are also other people that are legal scholars that can go through this in greater detail than I can. But anyway, I will give you my opinion and what I think about this. Maybe you agree or disagree, or maybe you just think this is interesting and perhaps bears further research on your part, in which case I would encourage you to go do that. But I thought the strikes were unconstitutional. When I read the Constitution, I don't see where the Constitution gives authorization to the president to carry out the type of strikes that he carried out. Okay? Now, but I knew that in putting a question out there, like I did on social media, where I kind of asked, hey, if you believe that these are constitutionally authorized, what article, section, and clause do you see that grants this type of authorization to the president? But I knew people were going to respond back and mention the War Powers Resolution. So the War Powers Resolution obviously is not part of the Constitution. Okay. Now it has been passed into law. I believe that took place in 1973. So there are people who would say this law gives it further explains what is considered to be the constitutionally authorized, powers that the Constitution grants to the president. Now, I personally am not a fan of the War Powers Resolution. I think the War Powers Resolution is itself unconstitutional. Okay. Now there's the strategic. Okay. So that's kind of the legal argument. You see my opinion there. I'm not saying it's a cut and dried case. My problem with the War Powers Resolution is that I think it goes outside the bounds and the constraints of the Constitution. I don't think it should have ever been passed into law, but it was passed into law. So now it like that does become problematic, and it does. I mean, we can have a debate about this, obviously, and people have and people do. But let's set that aside. So that's the legal question. Now, I did a video before where I talked about how you have to separate out the legal question from, is it a good idea strategically or in terms of a policy or whatever. That's totally separate. All right. Strategically, do I think it was a good idea? Well, see, that depends, because for me, if it's unconstitutional, I already think we shouldn't do it. Strategically, I also think it was very dangerous. And you could say, so there are going to be people who are going to say Israel engaged in some strategic brinkmanship by conducting a preemptive strike on Iran and then getting themselves into a situation where they had to be rescued by the United States. And therefore they tied Trump's hands. Now, I think there's an argument to be made for that, but I also think that kind of all of these players, I mean, I don't think these are independent actors that are making their own decisions. I think this was planned by people whose names aren't Netanyahu, Trump, et cetera. So that's kind of what I think. So I think a lot of this was probably planned out beforehand more than I think that Netanyahu was making decisions, and he made decisions. He kind of engaged in this type of brinkmanship that that in which he backed himself into a corner, knowing that by doing so, Trump was going to have to come in and do what he did. Um, and there are people who would credit him for that, and there are people who would say that's dangerous. He should not have done that because he's putting a lot of his own people at risk. Regardless of whether you see it that way or not, I don't necessarily see it that way because I think a lot of this was just planned, beforehand. Anyway, so for me, I don't necessarily enter into the debate of strategically, was it necessary or unnecessary? Was it a good idea or a bad idea for Trump to engage in these strikes on Iran? Because I'm against it. I'm against the strikes, but I'm also against the war in the first place. And I'm also against all U.S. involvement in the war, but I also don't think that this stuff is totally organic and that this just happened because Netanyahu decided that he was going to conduct a preemptive strike on Israel. I think it just goes deeper than that. Now, when the U.S. carried out its strikes, it did elicit condemnation from other countries. And I'll give you one example. So Putin spoke out. Now, there were others as well, but, Putin spoke out. And that was one of the issues that people were bringing up. Hey, what happens if powerful countries start to kind of come to Iran's aid? And when people are talking about powerful countries that could potentially come to Iran's aid, they principally mean China, Russia, but also other countries like, North Korea, other of Israel's neighbors in the region, etc. But anyway, so Putin and others condemned the strikes, but Putin didn't directly come to Iran's aid. Kim Jong-un made a statement as well. But anyway, but we didn't see these other countries come to Iran's direct aid. Now, this is interesting because the 1973 Yom Kippur War, look it up, right? But anyway, that was kind of seen as this proxy war, right in the cold, right during the Cold War, right? This proxy war between the West and the Soviet Union, primarily the United States, and the Soviet Union. This did not quite emerge the same way this time, at least on the side of Iran. On the side of Israel, it did, in that the United States did categorically entered into the war. Anyway, so what happened after Operation Midnight Hammer? These U.S. strikes on Isfahan, Natanz, and Fordow, and we're going to come back to this in a moment. So Iran did respond by conducting strikes on U.S. bases. Now, that was something that was feared all along, is that Iran could respond by hitting bases in the region. And then everyone was kind of raising up the red alert warnings when we all heard that the USS Nimitz was going to head into the region. And I think people were right to kind of, raise the red flag and say, hey, we need to kind of have eyes on what's happening here, right? But anyway, so what ended up happening is Iran did lob some missiles at U.S. bases in Qatar, or Qatar, as some people pronounce it. And it seems that those were largely inconsequential. No major damage, no casualties. And many people immediately said this was a faith-saving measure. This was just meant to serve as some type of response. This is Iranian leadership saying, hey, we can't just allow these strikes to happen by the U.S. and not do anything. We've got to respond, but we're going to do it in a way that doesn't further escalate. Trump appeared to, if that's true, if we take that at face value, Trump appeared to recognize that for what it was and tolerate it, I guess would be the appropriate word. I'm not necessarily saying that's what it was, because I think a lot of this has been kind of planned, all along to some degree. That doesn't mean that missiles haven't been fired, though. I'll come back to that in a moment. But anyway, so then what happened? So on the 24th, Trump, as we've been told, masterfully brokers a ceasefire. And this was also, he's getting a lot of credit for this, but it was also chaotic as it was happening because there were these weird reports that, well, first of all, everyone was super confused as to when this ceasefire would go into effect. When I say everyone, I mean like us, like the American public. I'm not saying necessarily that Iranian leadership or Israeli leadership was necessarily confused, but there were all these conflicting reports as to whether or not Iran had actually accepted the terms of the ceasefire. And then there were these conflicting reports about what time it was going to start. And then um, there was this there was this confusion about, hey, is Iran going to enter into the ceasefire 12 hours before Israel? And then at what time does it actually start? So in the end, I think it actually started at midnight, US Eastern time, so DC time. And then at noon, so 12 hours later, DC time, Israel enters into the ceasefire and whatever. So whatever happened, we're now in ceasefire. But it wasn't without some drama there because there were these reports that there was this single Iranian missile that had been launched, and Israel was, all up in arms, perhaps literally. And um, Trump says, Israel, you better not respond, do not drop those bombs, blah blah blah. So there was a lot of drama kind of in the closing hours leading up to the actual implementation of the ceasefire. And then you got these weird comments that were made by Trump where he's like, he sounds like he's super pissed at Israel. And then he's talking about both countries and he says, they've been fighting each other for so long and so hard that, quote, they don't know what the fuck they're doing, unquote. Trump said that, not me. I'm just telling you what Trump said. But then everybody was all up in arms that he was dropping F bombs. See what I did there? Um, so that's kind of where we are now. Now, if you look at some reports, and I did look at some reports, and you could go search these anywhere. Everything that I'm telling you, you could just do quick searches, and this will all come up. Um, I'm not pulling any information from some source that I have or whatever. This is all just you do a quick internet search and just start looking for what's out there, and that's where I'm just pulling all this from, just to kind of give us a quick timeline of the high points that have happened, throughout these 12 days. But supposedly, Iran has suffered about 620 deaths and potentially has as many as 4,800 that have been wounded. And some of those that have been killed are perhaps scientists. And then I think there were some reports that even some high ranking military officers had been killed. I think some of those were later refuted. So it's really hard to tell. On the Israeli side, Israel appears to have suffered maybe as many as 28 dead and about 3,200 wounded. So is that true? Is that not true? I don't know. I'm just telling you kind of what's being reported out there. Now, there's been a lot of confusion all along. How much is true? What's not true? Kind of parsing reality from fiction. Can we trust what we see? And those are important questions. So on the one hand, some people will say this is all staged. None of this is real. And then others will say, oh, this is all totally organic. I mean, you got a lot of the brainwashed masses out there that just think this is all totally organic. Oh my gosh, Iran can't have a bomb. Israel, blah, blah, blah. But there's a whole lot of area in between along the spectrum between those two extremes. And I think it is fair and appropriate to ask questions of what are we seeing and how much of this is real? Because there were people who were asking questions, particularly in the first days of this war, that they were saying, hey, there don't necessarily seem to be a lot of casualties being reported, which is why I shared the casualty count, at least in terms of what's being reported now, just in mainstream sources. Are those true? I'm not here to say one way or the other, right? Because there were people who weren't not necessarily saying like, oh, this is all staged, none of this is real, meaning like, hey, these images are fake, or they're recycling imagery from, they're recycling footage and videos from previous conflicts and previous, missiles being fired, whatever. But there were other people who were saying, hey, no, the missiles are being fired and there's probably some damage, but this is not the two sides trying to significantly damage one another. And I don't know. I'm not taking a hard opinion one way or the other on that because I don't necessarily know. I do think that there is some theatrical aspect to this. I do think this was planned on all sides. I do think that when it comes to the conflict in this region of the world, I do believe that a lot of it is a manufactured dialectic that has been put into place inorganically. But that doesn't mean that there are no tensions. That doesn't mean um, that there's no room for independent action. I just think that the major decisions, though, are planned. I don't think that I don't think that Netanyahu has the authority, from the global leaders that I think totally control Israel and the United States for that matter. Um, I don't think that he can just start a war with Iran without approval, so to speak. And I've spoken on this before. Um, it's like the mafia. You can't just decide to go like you have to get authorization to go conduct a hit. Particularly if it's on like kind of a prominent person in another family or whatever. Because if you don't get that authorization, at the end of the day, it's politics within the mafia families. If you don't get authorization, you could perhaps put into motion all of these escalations that result in a war between families. You know, so if you're a lower ranking member and you want to perform some hit for whatever reason, you got to get authorization. You know, so now just take that example, extrapolate that much larger, but the globalist leaders, out of I don't know the city of London or wherever, right? That I think totally control Israel, totally control the United States. The question is, to what degree do they control Iran? And I think that's a great question. Some people would say totally. Iran is totally in on this. Other people would say, no, Iran's not. They're trying to bring Iran into the fold, which is why Iran had to be attacked. And we're all aware of like Wesley Clark and this report that came out 20 plus years ago about the 7 countries in 5 days. Um, Whatever. I'm well aware of Wesley Clark's statements on that. I don't know exactly what the intent behind those reports from Wesley Clark was, because sometimes I'm a little bit skeptical about some of these countries that supposedly don't have central banks or whatever. So I don't exactly know how controlled Iran is by the globalist powers. My assumption is they are quite controlled and that they were to some degree playing along. There are people who would disagree with me, and that's okay. I'm not. I don't pretend to necessarily know totally. Um, like I do tend to think that Russia is controlled by the globalists. China too. I don't see Putin as some like antagonist to the globalist world order. You're supposed to believe that, just like you're supposed to believe that Trump is fighting the deep state here in the United States. But I think Trump is an asset of the deep state, though they've crafted this narrative to make it look like he's attacking the deep state. And I would say that same model has been applied to Putin globally, right? That he's supposed to be the statesman that he's the only guy in the world who actually understands what's going on and is smart enough to actually make real decisions, blah blah blah. And sure, he may be, but I think he's under the globalist thumb. But they've gone to great length. They've put into um, they've carried out these influence operations to make Putin, at least in the eyes of the West, look like for people in the West who are aware of the globalist designs. A lot of them look at Putin and they see someone who is actually in opposition to all the bad things in the West that are being conducted at the hands of the globalists, right? And that's why Putin will often say things that we all agree with. But that, of course, could be part of the influence operation. Anyway, we're getting lost here. Okay, so um, I do believe that this was somewhat theatrical. I don't exactly know how much. Do I believe that there's been infrastructure damage? Yes. Do I believe that people have been killed? Yes. Do I believe that people are suffering on both sides? Yes. Yes. And that's why I think that this stuff is so bad, is because you can have leaders that are almost working together, right? Behind the scenes, engage in a war, and that war can still be devastating for their people. I think that has happened in the past, could happen in the future, and to some degree could explain what happened here. But I don't have a definitive answer one way or the other. I'm kind of thinking out loud. You guys let me know in the comments what you think. Now, confusion remains. One of the topics right now is how much damage was suffered by Iran's nuclear sites. Now, let me just say right here, I do not have a hard opinion one way or the other on the existence of nuclear weapons. I know that right now this is one of those things that is debated. I've only looked into it a little bit. I do have friends who do not believe in nuclear weapons. I don't know. I do think that if you believe that nuclear weapons don't exist, I do not find that position unreasonable. I'm not totally there yet myself, but I don't find that position unreasonable because I do think that there are so many things that are told to us that are just total nonsense and are narratives that are crafted that countries around the world go along with as control mechanisms. I mean, look at what happened during the COVID op. So do I think that it is at least plausible that nuclear weapons don't exist, but that we have been led to believe over the last 8 decades that they do exist because this was one of the entire framing mechanisms behind the Cold War? I find that like that could be. I'm not totally there yet, but yeah, that could be. That would not surprise me at all. And in some ways, it even makes sense. It's kind of funny because in my undergrad days, I actually studied nuclear engineering. It wasn't my major, but I did have some nuclear engineering classes. But of course, we would focus a lot on not just like nuclear weapons and stuff, but also on nuclear energy. And it's 20 plus years ago. I don't in any way pretend to be an expert on this, but I do find it interesting. So set that aside. What you personally believe about the existence or non-existence of nuclear weapons. Okay, set that aside. We'll come back to that though. So there are these discussions right now about the damage that may or may not have been suffered by the Iranian nuclear sites. Okay, because there are all these conflicting reports. So on the one hand, you have Trump, you have Hegseth that claim massive destruction. Israel also claims massive destruction. Iran's nuclear program has been irreparably harmed, right? Or at least it's been set back, years or whatever. Now, the media claims otherwise. And so my first reaction here is, okay, why do I need to feel bound to trust a lying presidential administration or the lying media? And oh, by the way, you'll notice that the two sides of this argument, of course, both take as a given the existence of nuclear weapons and the fact that Iran had a nuclear program. It's just how much has that nuclear program been set back, right? But the whole framing of the argument, this dialectical frame takes as a given the existence of nuclear weapons and the existence, to some degree, of Iran's nuclear program, and that they have been a threat to Israel and potentially the United States, and could at some point in the future, whether in the near future or the far future, be a threat again. So I do kind of keep that in my mind when I'm just kind of thinking about, okay, this does reinforce the idea that nukes do exist, which could be intentional to cover the fact that they, don't exist. Anyway, I'm just throwing that out there. Now, why does the media say that the damage suffered at these sites is actually much less than is being claimed by the administration? Because there was supposedly a leak that came out that said that the damage was much less extensive than is being claimed. Now, leaks, you never know what a leak really is, because leaks are sometimes done intentionally. So I would just say with this, exercise caution. You see all the sycophants on one side that are just, and it is sickening. It is ridiculous because you got all these members of Congress. Members of Congress don't work for Trump. Okay, they're not even in the same branch of government. But you see all these Republican sycophants just completely licking Trump's boots, and I mean, it's just completely disgusting. It's completely pathetic, like pathetic. Even if you're a member of Congress who's a Republican, and even if you kind of like Trump or whatever, don't act like that. You look like a fool. You are a disgrace if you do that. Okay. Um. Anyway, so yeah, so you got some claims that there's extensive damage. You got this leak that supposedly refutes that. Iran says, yeah, there was some damage, but there was some superficial damage, and yeah, sure, but that we actually moved out a lot of the equipment and the personnel, et cetera. And you've got some other reports from some other independent reports that are saying, yeah, you can see some of the outer damage, but that it's hard to assess exactly what happened inside. I haven't done some sort of analysis of the imagery, and I don't consider myself to have the type of expertise that you would need. um just because you're in the military doesn't mean that you're like some sort of munitions expert. And I'm certainly not an expert on what nuclear facilities would look like. And I'm not an expert on like mining or whatever. So I'm not going to tell you what I think about how much damage was or was not actually caused. um and I also I'm not I mean, I'm not entirely interested in it necessarily. So anyway, the other thing that I'll mention is Trump is now so Trump, a couple of days ago, he was super pissed at Netanyahu. He says these countries don't know what the fuck they're doing. He tells Netanyahu, you better not drop those bombs. Now he's defending Netanyahu because Netanyahu is facing all these legal challenges. I mean, he's been facing legal challenges, all these corruption charges for a long time. And now Trump's saying, oh, this is nonsense, shut down these investigations, whatever. So what happens now? I don't know, but this isn't over. So I was having a conversation with some friends last night, and I had a friend who's very smart, and he likened this to a 50 act play, which is kind of funny. I mean, obviously he's being, kind of, I mean, he's comically exaggerating when he says, 50 acts. But what he's saying is, you think of a normal play that's a couple of acts, and this is something much larger. And people think it's over when it's not over. And it's kind of funny that he said that. And I responded to him that I have a very similar idea in my mind, just a slightly different analogy, but very similar idea. And that is, I see that a lot of people are treating this as a movie, where for me, it's merely the conclusion of one season of a series that's going to have, several additional seasons that are going to follow on subsequently. So we may have seen a season finale, and yeah, there is a sense of some resolution, but there are also all of these other lingering issues that will carry into the next season of the series, right? So and that's kind of where I see that we're at. I don't see that this has reached some sort of terminal conclusion or some sense of finality. I think it would be naive for us to think that. Now, I put out some videos in January. This was so I put the first one out right before Trump took office. So, the inauguration was on January 20th. I put a video out on January 11th called What to Look Out For in 2025. I followed that video up a short time later with a video called Vigilance, the watchword of 2025. I think that's what I called it. And what I was driving at in those two videos was, here's what I think is on the horizon for 2025. And in that first video, what to look out for in 2025, and you can go find it, I said, I think they're going to set the stage for war, and I think they're going to build out the digital control grid. And I think both of those have happened over the last, 5 months, since the end of January through now the end of June. But also, if you look at those two, they're basically two sides of the same coin. Because the same attitude that pushes for war abroad, that says, oh, there's some threat out there, and we got to be ready for it. That same attitude, that same spirit can also be used to implement security measures here domestically that otherwise the people wouldn't go for. Just think about everything that happened in terms of security measures in the immediate wake of 9/11. because to some degree, some of those security measures that were implemented still exist and persist 20 plus years later, 24 years later almost. So kind of two sides of the same coin. Our government is in the process of building out the techno state. I've talked about this before. I've talked about Doge being a smokescreen for, building out the techno state. So we're already starting to hear reports of, sleeper cells that could be activated here inside our borders. Many people were raising the kind of the red alert or the alarm signal for potential false flags, myself included. I was saying, hey, we're in false flag territory right now. And we still are. We still are. So we have to still be vigilant, like I said in the one video a couple of months ago. And you don't have to feel obligated to immediately take a side when this stuff happens. A lot of people, this stuff would happen and they would immediately say, oh, Israel's the good guys. Israel the good guys. That immediately makes Iran the bad guys. And they'll say Israel the good guys because, we have so many Americans that have been duped into this psyop that is Zionism, which is just totally ridiculous. This idea that, biblical Israel is the modern Middle East state of Israel nowadays. I mean, there's no truth to that whatsoever. And I think that Zionism is not only dangerous, but it's also just historically illiterate, Anyway, but there are many Americans. I have friends who truly believe this. They unconditionally support Israel. So Israel is the good guy, which means Iran is the bad guy. There are other people who hate everything that Israel does. That makes Israel the bad guy. That means that Iran is the good guy. Then there are other people who aren't so much, maybe they're not necessarily focused on Israel, but they're focused on Iran. Everything Iran does is bad. Iran is an enemy of the United States. So because Iran is the bad guy, well, then that makes Israel the good guy. I don't necessarily know many people in the United States who focus on Iran first and say Iran is the good guy. I feel like if you're in the United States and you focus on Iran first, like you focus on Iran before you focus on Israel, it would be because you label Iran the bad guy and therefore you see Israel as the good guy. But plenty of people in the United States look at Israel first, and some would say good guy, and others would say, bad guy. So my whole thing, and I'm very critical of Israel, very, very critical of Israel. That doesn't mean that I think, the Iranians are the good guys, but I don't feel obliged to side with Iran or Israel. Like I don't feel in any way obliged to do that whatsoever. Now, I do have friends who served in the military, because this is an important point. I have friends who served in the military, just like I did for a long time. And they do harbor deep-seated resentment against Iran. And I can understand that. Do I think it's as justified as maybe they think it is? No, not necessarily. But that doesn't mean that I don't think that I do understand where it comes from. Now, why do they feel that deep-seated resentment? So if you haven't looked at a map in a while, over the last 20 plus years, we've sent a lot of troops, myself included, to a certain region of the world, to various countries over there, but primarily to Afghanistan and Iraq. Well, there's a country right smack dab in the middle of Afghanistan and Iraq, and that's Iran. Okay. And particularly if you served in Iraq, which I didn't. I went to Afghanistan multiple times. I never personally served in Iraq. But if you did go to Iraq, and obviously I have many friends that did go to Iraq, it was well known that there were Iranians that were supporting a lot of the Iraqi militias, to include with certain tactics that were being used, but also with certain equipment or weaponry that would be used. And so if you're familiar with the idea of the IEDs, the improvised explosive devices, or I think most people are familiar with that acronym because it was used so heavily in the media. But if not, just the concept of like a roadside bomb, which were so devastating, particularly in Iraq, were so devastating to U.S. service members. killed and injured a lot of U.S. service members. Um, but a lot of those techniques or the tactics that employed those techniques or the devices themselves and how those devices were built and the training required, a lot of that came from the Iraqis, or excuse me, came to the Iraqis from Iranians, particularly with a specific type of device that was used. Is called an EFP, an explosively formed penetrator. So an explosively formed penetrator is like a very specialized variant of a shape charge, if that means anything to you, and for most people, it probably doesn't. But anyway, these were particularly devastating to a lot of American service members. I mean, I was on deployments to Afghanistan and stuff, where kind of different tactics were used. The terrain is different, so but even as I was coming up through though in training and blah blah blah, you would hear about the EFPs, and it was known that the EFPs that not just the it's a fairly sophisticated idea, but it was known that this idea had come from the Iranians, and anyway, the Iraqi militias were using this, et cetera, et cetera. So there are service members nowadays that harbor this deep-seated resentment toward Iran, and I'm saying I get it. But there's another side to that, which is, well, why exactly were we in the region? What, because of weapons of mass destruction or 9/11? I mean, just all these lies. So anyway, just in conclusion here, my point is, I don't necessarily, between Israel and Iran, I don't necessarily feel the need to side with one or the other. I used to, I used to be a fan of Israel for a long time. I mean, that's part of my deconditioning program, or part of deprogramming myself as well. I was never a Zionist, but I was pro-Israel, just because I would buy all the arguments that everybody else buys, for a long time about that region. But yeah, I was never a Zionist. But I also, just being in the military, I also had like a military appreciation for Israel, because their IDF is very skilled, and Mossad, who I think is basically a terrorist organization, just like the CIA, MI6, and incidentally, they do support and fund and train a lot of Islamic terror. I made a comment a couple of days ago on social media where I said, if you scratch an Islamic fundamentalist terrorist, you'll find the CIA or Mossad beneath. If you keep scratching, you'll find MI6. I totally believe that. The dirty tricks that CIA and Mossad learned, they largely learned, from MI6. But I used to have kind of this military appreciation for the IDF, and as I guess from a skills capability standpoint, I can still appreciate their skill set, but I am a strong critic of the Israeli government for everything that I do think it's largely a crime syndicate. But anyway, so that's kind of where I'm at today. So I don't have any. I've never been to Israel. I've never been to Iran. I've met Israelis. They were great people. Great people. I have also met Iranians, also great people, the individuals that I met. So I have no resentment towards either of those groups of people. I'm sure culturally I'd probably have more in common with the Israelis, and as much as I criticize the Israeli government, and believe me, I criticize the Iranian government too. Don't get me wrong. But like I say, probably just rambling here, but I'll return to my point that I don't feel bound to assume I have to side with one or the other, because I think so much of this stuff is part of like manufactured dialectics anyway. So I know that if a large war pops up, and I do believe that they're going to continue to set the stage for war, I don't think we're done. I do know that the United States is going to be on Israel's side and Iran's going to be on the other side. Like, I get all that. But, I don't want to just take it as a foregone conclusion that these these wars are going to happen. I mean, I do think they're going to set the stage for them, but that's one of the reasons why I put out my small voice here. I'm not saying that I'm going to change the world with these videos. I'm not claiming that at all. But I'm just trying to do my very, very small part to just say, hey, let's not sit back and just hang out on the couch when we should be standing up and we should be resisting what is happening. We should be challenging this rather than just kind of passively allowing it to happen, which is what the majority of Americans do. So anyway, hey, those are just some of my thoughts on kind of where we're at. Um, I hope that made some sense. And yeah, right now with what happened at the nuclear sites, listen, I don't know. I'm not super concerned about it one way or the other because I don't trust what Trump and Hegseth say any more than I trust what the media says or some leak. And I just assume that a lot of that is probably part of the theater. But um, even though I do believe that there is an element, perhaps even a significant element of theatrics here, I sympathize greatly with those who are suffering on either side, Israel or Iran, that have lost family members or that were perhaps wounded or in other ways have suffered because of these strikes that have happened. So anyway, hey, thanks. I had refrained on sharing my thoughts on this, at least in a video. So now I've got some commentary that is out there, and we'll continue to watch the situation. And I'm sure I'll offer some more commentary as we go forward as the situation, continues to develop in some way. Thanks.